412 people. That was the final head count I confirmed at dawn, 6 hours before we reached the portal. I had been running head counts since the staging camp outside Tamanrasset collapsed. 11 days of marching south through sand the Saharan wind erased behind us as fast as we crossed it. 11 days of quarter-litre water rations, heat casualties on improvised stretchers, children too dehydrated to cry. I checked the numbers each morning and night because that was the job. I had spent 14 years with FEMA coordinating disaster evacuations across the American Southwest before the aquifer failures shut the agency down and turned its employees into the refugees we used to process. Counting heads, managing column spacing, keeping desperate populations moving through terrain that wanted to kill them. That was what I knew. The only difference now was that I was walking with them instead of riding ahead in a government vehicle. The column stretched a full kilometre behind me, divided into 10 sections, 9 sections of 40. One rear section of 52, swollen by late arrivals, stragglers, and the people other groups could not absorb cleanly. Each section had a coordinator with a handheld radio. I had trained them during the staging camp's final week, teaching stagger spacing and rest rotations, the same protocols I had drilled into FEMA field teams during the Colorado River collapse. Basic crowd logistics. The kind of competence that makes you useful enough to put in charge but never important enough to protect. Dennis Ware walked the middle sections, moving between groups with his paramedics bag slung across both shoulders. He had joined the refugee stream out of Tucson when the Southwest went dry, and I recruited him at the Algerian border because a 400-person crossing without medical staff was a body count waiting to happen. Dennis had a dry, tired way of talking that made bad news easier to absorb, and he never wasted motion. That morning, I watched him give the last mouthful from his own bottle to a girl whose mother had stopped producing tears 2 days earlier. He told the mother it was surplus. She believed him because she needed to. I saw his hand shake when he capped the empty bottle and tucked it back into his bag. I trusted Dennis the way you trust someone whose competence you have watched under pressure. Provisionally, but enough. Ahead of us, the portal waited. It hung above a ridge of compacted dunes like a curtain of heat distortion turned vertical, 3 stories tall, wide enough for 60 people to walk through abreast. From a distance it looked like a mirage, the air bending and swimming the way it does over sun-baked asphalt. But mirages reflect the sky. This reflected something else. Through the shimmer, a sun too large and too red sat above a desert of the wrong colour. Darker, mineral hard, under a yellow sky that belonged to no atmosphere I had ever studied. I had noted the discrepancy in my survey report 3 weeks earlier. Optical artifact from the energy field, I had written. Atmospheric refraction consistent with high-energy boundary phenomena. Language that sounded measured and professional and meant absolutely nothing. I had never seen a portal before. Nobody had. The international survey teams that first confirmed its existence published contradictory findings for 6 months before the climate collapse, made academic debate irrelevant. By then, the Sahara portal was the only option left for 200,000 people camped across southern Algeria with nowhere else to go. 3 weeks before this crossing, I sent a 5-person advanced survey team through. Good people. Trained. They carried atmospheric sensors, 10 days of supplies, and a relay transmitter programmed with a coded signal set. Green for viable, red for hostile, amber for inconclusive. 48 hours after they stepped through the shimmer and vanished, the transmitter burst came back. Green. A coded pulse without voice or data. I built my survey report on that signal. I recommended the full crossing to the caravan's informal leadership council. 412 people packed what they could carry and started marching south on my word. The advance team did not transmit again. I explained the silence to myself as equipment failure. Sand, heat, power drain. Reasonable explanations. The kind you accept because the alternative is admitting you sent 400 people toward a door you cannot see through based on a single pulse from the only scouts who could tell you what waited beyond it. We reached the portal ridge at midday. I positioned myself at the column's head and called the first section forward on the radio. 40 people gathered at the shimmer's edge. Families, a few elderly men leaning on younger arms. A cluster of teenage boys who had walked the entire 11 days barefoot because their shoes disintegrated on day 3. They stared at the red sun on the other side. I gave the order to cross. They stepped through. The shimmer swallowed them in silence. They were walking on sand, and then they were gone, and the portal surface showed the alien desert undisturbed. I sent the second section, the third, the fourth. For over an hour I managed the flow, keeping the column disciplined, pacing the sections at 2-minute intervals so the exit side would not jam with confused arrivals. Standard crowd movement protocol. I had evacuated twice this many people through highway choke points during the Phoenix water riots. The work was familiar enough to keep my hands busy and my mind away from the silence on the other side. Dennis and I crossed with the rear section. 52 people, including the stragglers who had joined us after dawn, and the coordinators I had kept with me to manage the final push. I stepped into the shimmer and felt pressure across my whole body, like walking into a wall of warm gelatin that gave way just enough to let me through. The sensation lasted 2 seconds. Then I was standing on different ground under a different sky, blinking against light from a sun that filled a quarter of the horizon. The heat was immediate and heavy, 10 or 15 degrees worse than the Sahara. The air entered my lungs thin and stale, breathable but stripped of something essential, like altitude sickness at sea elevation. The sand here was dark, a mineral hardpan the color of dried blood, packed tight and scattered with low rock ridges that jutted from the flatness like broken teeth. The sky was a sickly yellow-brown, the color of old bruises. The caravan was regrouping in a wide basin 300 meters from the portal's exit point. Section coordinators called names and counted heads. Children cried. Men argued over water rations already lower than what we had carried through. I counted sections and confirmed the number. 412. Everyone had made it across. Then I walked the perimeter and found the dead. The remains started 200 meters from the portal exit and spread in a wide arc across the basin floor, thickest directly ahead of the shimmer, thinning at the edges. Shoes. Hundreds of shoes. Sandals, boots, sneakers, children's plastic slides, pressed into the mineral sand, as if their owners had been plucked upward and the footwear had stayed behind. Prayer beads, knotted and scattered. Crushed water cans, dozens of them flattened and corroded. Scraps of clothing stiff with mineral crust, and among them, visible once I knelt and brushed the surface grit away, bones. Sun-bleached and split. Rib sections. Femurs. A pelvis half buried in the hardpan, cracked lengthwise. The remains extended as far as I could see. I radioed Dennis. He crossed the basin to me and crouched over a rough pile of long bones. He examined them, then turned a femur in his hands and held it up so I could see the surface. Scoring marks, he said. Parallel grooves, evenly spaced. Same depth, same angle, repeated across the shaft. Something cut these, something with a tool, or something shaped like a tool. I took the bone from him and ran my thumb across the grooves. They were precise, consistent, machine-regular intervals carved into the cortical surface, deep enough to catch my fingernail. Dennis looked past me toward the basin, where the living were still counting themselves among the dead. "Ray," he said, low enough that only I could hear it. "Where's the camp?" I had briefed everyone on the expected setup. A forward base 200 meters from the portal exit, supply cache, relay transmitter, signal flags. My team had carried enough equipment to establish a visible staging point the main caravan could orient on after crossing. The camp was gone. The supply cache, transmitter mast, signal flags, canvas, antennas, reflective tape, orange markers. Every human trace I had promised would be waiting for us had vanished. For several seconds I kept searching the terrain as if the camp might resolve out of the heat distortion if I found the right angle. The only trace was a single aluminum equipment stake driven into the hardpan 50 meters from where I stood, snapped off at the base as if something had wrenched the upper section away. I scanned the terrain beyond the bone field. To the south, a ridge of dark rock ran along the horizon, maybe 8 or 9 kilometers out. Its face showed shallow caves or overhangs, possible shelter, possible water seepage. Between us and the ridge, open desert, flat, exposed, bare. Behind us, the portal shimmered. I walked back to it and pressed my palm against the surface. The warm pressure resisted, pushed back, held. I leaned into it with my shoulder. My hand did not pass through. The shimmer showed the Saharan dunes on the other side, golden sand under a white sun, but the barrier was solid from this direction. I tried again, harder. Dennis tried. 2 section coordinators threw their weight against it together. The portal was a one-way door. 412 people stood in a bone field under a red sun, with no way back. I had put every one of them there. I gave the order to march south toward the rock ridge. It was the only decision that made sense. The basin had bones instead of water, open ground instead of shelter, and a killing sun already climbing higher. The ridge was the only visible terrain feature in any direction. We could reach it before nightfall if we pushed hard. The column reformed. 412 people with whatever water remained in their bottles and jugs, walking single file across a dark desert toward a ridge they could barely see, following a man whose professional recommendation had brought them through a door that locked behind them. We had covered roughly 5 kilometers when the sound started. A high metallic shriek, sustained and wavering, carried from the east across open ground. It rose and held for 10 seconds, then dropped away. Before the silence settled, another answered from the west, the same pitch, the same wavering sustain, slightly offset in timing, so the 2 sounds overlapped and created a disorienting harmonic that made distance and direction hard to judge. The column stopped. 400 people stood on the hardpan and listened. I watched their faces shift from confusion to the flat, locked expression civilians wear when they understand they are in danger and have no training for it. I raised my binoculars and scanned the eastern horizon. Figures. Tall. 6 of them spread in a loose arc, moving at a walking pace, spaced roughly 100 meters apart. They were too far away for detail, but the proportions were wrong. Torsos canted forward over legs that bent at angles human knees cannot achieve, arms too long, heads too narrow. Heat distortion smeared their outlines, but I could see the movement clearly enough. They walked with a ground-covering stride that matched our column's pace exactly. Behind each figure, tethered on long cables, something angular and dark rode the thermals 30 meters up. Kites, metal-framed, wide-winged, catching the hot updrafts and swaying in controlled arcs. The cables ran from the kites to harness rigs on the figures' backs. When the kites banked against the wind, their frames produced the shrieking, metal edges vibrating at frequencies tuned to carry across the uninterrupted kilometers of open ground. Hunting instruments built for a landscape sound could cross cleanly. I swung the binoculars west. More figures. 8. In a wider arc, moving on the same bearing. The 2 groups formed a crescent around our flanks and closed gradually behind us, cutting the line of retreat toward the portal basin. I had seen this pattern before. Livestock management, crowd channeling. The figures held their pace, matched our speed, tightened the arc by degrees. They were herding us. The kite's screams pushed our flanks inward, compressed the column, triggered the crowd panic instinct that makes people bunch together and run as a mass. The arc tightened from behind and the sides, leaving one direction open, forward toward the rock ridge, into a narrowing valley between 2 ridge arms that funneled the terrain ahead of us into a bottleneck. I keyed the radio and told the section coordinators to keep their groups tight, maintain spacing, and move toward the ridge at a steady pace. Running would burn water and scatter the column. Discipline would buy time. It bought us 40 minutes. The column covered another 3 kilometers before the herding tightened. The kites screamed closer now, low enough that I could hear the cable vibration beneath the shriek. The figures on our flanks were visible without binoculars, 2.5 meters tall, maybe taller, moving on double-jointed legs with a smooth, tireless gait. Their skin was dark and ridged, built for this sun. Their forelimbs split below the elbows into paired arms, 4 manipulator hands per individual, each pair working independently. They carried no weapons I could identify. They had the terrain, the kites, and the patience of predators who had done this before. At the valley's narrowing, a subgroup broke from the eastern arc and sprinted forward with a speed that made everything I had assumed about their pace irrelevant. They covered 600 meters in under a minute and cut across the column's center, splitting the mass of people in 2. The larger group, 324 by the last partial count I heard over the radio, was driven forward into the valley, compressed between the ridge arms, moving toward whatever collection point waited at the bottleneck. Screaming, stumbling, carrying children, dropping supplies. I heard 2 coordinators calling names until the radio dissolved into static and open mic panic. I watched them go and could do nothing to stop it. My group, 88 people, including Dennis and 4 section coordinators, was cut off laterally and driven west toward broken ground where the ridgeline fractured into a canyon system. I made the decision in seconds. The canyons would break the herding pattern. The kites could not maneuver in narrow spaces. The tall figure's long-limbed stride would lose its advantage on uneven terrain. I called to the section coordinators near me, pointed toward the canyon mouths, and we ran. It worked. The canyons swallowed us into shade and broken rock, and the kite screams receded behind us as the hunting party pulled back to the open ground where its tactics functioned. I counted heads in the first wide bend of the canyon. 88 people, 4 section coordinators, Dennis with his medic bag pressed against his ribs, a child with a broken arm from the stampede wrapped in a strip of torn shirt. We were alive. We were also deeper in the wasteland than ever, out of water, separated from 324 people whose fate I could picture clearly enough, and farther from the portal than we had been an hour ago. Every decision I had made since the crossing, forward instead of staying at the basin, south toward the ridge, west into the canyons, had been reasonable. Everyone had carried us farther from the only landmark that mattered, and deeper into a country that hunted us like game. The scouts found us on the second morning. We had spent the night in a wide section of canyon where the walls blocked the wind and the temperature dropped enough for the children to sleep. Dennis worked through the dark, treating dehydration, crush injuries from the stampede, heat blisters, the boy's broken arms set and splinted with aluminum tent poles. He washed his hands with a capful of water, held it in his palm like mercury, then used the same water to wipe blood from the child's face before it dried into his eyes. Nobody thanked him. They were too tired, and he had never done the kind of work that expects thanks. The 88 of us sat or lay against the canyon walls and listened to the kite screams passing far above us, distant enough to mean the hunting parties were working the open ground. I sat with my back to the rock and watched red stars through the slit of sky overhead, running logistics calculations I could not solve. Water for 88 people at 0 current supply. Distance to the portal at an unknown bearing through unmapped canyons. Communication with the 324 severed. Terrain unknown. Threat unknown. Rules unknown. At dawn, 3 men appeared on the canyon rim above us. They were human. Sun darkened, wrapped in fabric against the heat, carrying walking staves and slung water containers. They stood on the rim and looked down at our group with the calm assessment of men who had expected to find us there. One raised a hand. It was not exactly a greeting, more an acknowledgement. He called down in American-accented English, asking how many we were and when we had crossed. His name was Garrett Reynolds, a big man, mid-40s, with the kind of deep tan that takes years to build, and a way of moving through canyon terrain that told me he had been walking this ground long enough to know every handhold. He came down the wall with his 2 scouts and distributed water from their containers, rationed, measured, enough to keep the children and worse dehydration cases from collapsing, not enough to be generous. He asked me the same question twice. How many had crossed through the portal? I told him 412. He nodded and repeated the number under his breath while he studied our group. Something in the way he counted us made the water taste wrong going down. He guided us through the canyon system for most of a day. The route twisted deeper into the rock, following paths marked with small cairns at intervals. Someone had mapped these canyons and built a navigation system through them. Late in the afternoon, the canyon widened into a deep, sheltered basin where the rock walls rose high enough to block the sun for most of the day. The settlement sat at the basin's center. Low structures built from salvaged materials, corrugated metal sheeting, woven fabric, stacked stone, anchored against the canyon walls, and draped with a heavy shade cloth I had never seen before. The fabric was dark, dense, woven in a pattern too regular and uniform to be human-made. It blocked the red sun almost completely. Under its cover, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. 120 people occupied the settlement. Men, women, children. I saw cook fires, water storage, a latrine system dug into a side canyon, sleeping pallets arranged in family clusters. Routine governed the place. People moved through tasks with the automation of long practice. Garrett's scouts reported to a supply station where dried rations were distributed from sealed containers, and a team of 4 men repaired a section of wall using mineral cement mixed from canyon rock and carefully measured water. Children watched us arrive from the shade. They did not stare like children seeing strangers. They counted, lips moving, fingers tucked against their palms. When one of them reached Dennis, his eyes moved to the medic bag and then to Garrett, as if waiting to see where that fact would be recorded. Garrett brought me to Halima. She met us in a shaded alcove near the settlement's center, seated on a low stone bench with a fabric satchel across her lap. She was perhaps 60, thin from the desert, but not wasted, with close-cropped grey hair and the posture of a woman accustomed to being listened to. She had been a school teacher, Garrett told me, part of the first wave of crossings roughly 2.5 years ago. She had survived by making herself necessary. She welcomed my group. Housing assignments distributed through Garrett. Water rations confirmed. Dennis was directed to an alcove where the settlement's injured were waiting. A man with an infected laceration, a boy with a fever, an elderly man whose feet had swollen beyond the ability to walk. Halima watched Dennis work for a moment and her expression changed. A quick, practical calculation moved behind her eyes. She was judging his usefulness to the settlement. "How long has this place existed?" I asked her. "Since the Tall Ones allowed it." She explained the arrangement in plain language, without apology or euphemism. The creatures I'd seen on the open ground, she called them the Tall Ones, permitted the settlement to exist because the settlement served them. 3 functions. Tracking. Garrett's scouts monitored the portal and located new arrivals before exposure killed them. Translation. Children raised in the settlement learned to interpret the shrieking patterns the Tall Ones produced through their hunting kites, which allowed a crude form of communication between species. Facilitation. The settlement directed the Tall Ones to groups of new arrivals, managed collection, and received payment. "Payment," I said. "Water, shade fabric, protein rations, medicine when they have it. The Tall Ones supply us per head. Every person we direct to them is a unit of trade." She opened the satchel on her lap and unrolled a length of woven cloth, maybe 2 meters long, covered edge to edge in small, tight handwriting, done in dark mineral ink. Names, dates, entries. Each line recorded a transaction, a person's name, what had been received in exchange, and the date of the trade. I scanned the columns and saw the economy of this place laid bare. Yusuf al-Rashid, 12 litres, 3 shade panels. David Cortez, 8 litres, antibiotics course. James Holder, Anna Holder, Michael Holder, 20 litres, protein rations for 30 days. Families traded as a unit. The ledger went back more than 2 years. Hundreds of names. You keep records, I said. I keep honest records. Everyone who was traded is written here. What was received for them is written here. I do not pretend the cost was something else. She took me to the nursery next. It was a deep alcove in the canyon wall, shaded and cool, where 14 children sat in 2 rows on woven mats. The youngest was perhaps 3. The oldest, a serious boy of 11 or 12, sat at the front with a small metal instrument fashioned from a flattened water can, curved and perforated along one edge. He raised it to his mouth and blew, producing a sharp, wavering shriek I recognized instantly. A smaller, thinner version of the kite call I had heard on the open desert. The other children repeated the sound in sequence, each varying the pitch and duration slightly. A lesson, call and response. 32 distinct patterns, Halima said. Enough for basic exchange. Arrival reports, head counts, direction, distance, compliance and refusal. The older children can translate during collection operations. I watched the 11-year-old boy shape another call. A longer, modulated shriek that rose and fell in a pattern I could almost pass as grammar. He played it twice, corrected a younger boy's attempt and played it again. Teaching. Their parents? I asked. Halima touched the cloth ledger. Recorded. I stood in the nursery alcove with the kite calls ringing off the canyon walls and looked at the cloth in her hands. I understood the place I had brought my people to. A community that survived by selling human beings to the creatures that hunted them. Managed by a woman who kept honest books, staffed by children who spoke the predator's language, and supplied by scouts who tracked new arrivals the way stockmen track wandering cattle. I had an advanced team, I said. 5 people. I sent them through the portal 3 weeks before the main crossing. They carried a relay transmitter. They sent back a green light signal 48 hours after crossing. Halima did not look surprised. She ran her finger down the ledger until she found what she wanted, then held the cloth open so I could read the entry. 5 names. My people. Recorded 15 days ago. Traded to the tall ones 4 days after Garrett's scouts brought them in. The payment column listed water, 60 litres, and the shade fabric that now covered the settlement's southern wall. For a moment I could not make the names stay names. They became columns, inventory, units against litres. Then they came back one by one. Mina Alvarez, who had argued with me about sensor placement until I admitted she was right. Cole Miller, who packed paperback novels into field kits because he said people made better decisions when they remembered sentences. Tariq El-Baz, who had kissed the casing of the relay transmitter before carrying it through the shimmer and told me not to worry. The transmitter, I said. Garrett sent the signal, Halima said. The green code. Your team gave it to us before we understood what it was for. When Garrett realized it would bring a larger group through the portal, he used it. The alcove was quiet except for the children practicing their calls. Halima watched me, waiting to see what I would do with information that could not be taken back. My advance team had been captured, traded, and consumed by this settlement's economy within a week of arrival. The signal I had built my survey report on, the signal that convinced me to march 412 people through a one-way door into a predator wasteland, had been sent by the man who sold my scouts for drinking water. I looked toward the settlement's southern wall. The shade fabric moved slightly in the hot draft slipping down the canyon, dark and dense and beautifully made. It held off the red sun. It cooled the sleeping alcoves. Children rested beneath it. My team had bought that shade with their bodies before I knew they were dead. Halima rolled the ledger closed and tucked it back into her satchel. Garrett gave my group 3 days, Standard grace period, he called it. The same courtesy extended to every batch of new arrivals, while the settlement absorbed them into housing, water, and labor rotations. On the fourth morning, he came to the alcove where I slept and sat on the stone floor across from me. The Tall One's intake cycle ran on a schedule he had mapped over 2 years of observation. Every 9 to 12 days, a collection party arrived at a designated clearing 3 kilometers outside the settlement's canyon system. The settlement was expected to produce tribute at each cycle. The current quota was 20 bodies per intake. The Tall Ones supplied water, shade fabric, and protein rations in proportion to the delivery. Fall short, and the supplies dropped. Fall short twice, and the Tall Ones revised the arrangement. Garrett had seen what revision looked like during the settlement's first year, and he described enough of it that I understood he was telling me specifically, so I would stop thinking resistance was an option. Your group is 88 people drawing on stores built for 120, Garrett said. The math is simple. 28 of yours go to the next intake, and the remaining 60 earn full membership. Water rights, shelter, labor rotation, protection. 60 people survive because 28 don't. I won't select people for tribute. You're paramedic, Garrett said. Dennis, a man with trauma training is worth more to this settlement than 20 random bodies are to the Tall Ones. I can guarantee his safety. Permanent protected status, same as the translators, same as my scouts. He stays here, he works, he is off the tribute rolls for good. All you have to do is help me organize the selection. 28 people from your group, you pick, you explain it to them, you manage the handoff. That's the trade. Dennis's safety purchased with my cooperation. 28 people I had marched through the portal, chosen by me, walked to a clearing and handed over to creatures that would hang them in metal frames above an alien city. And the man who had faked the signal that brought us here was offering this as a reasonable deal. There are 324 of my people missing in the valley, I said. Garrett's face did not change. Most of them are already counted somewhere else. He let that sit between us. I spent the next 2 days organizing a breakout. The plan was built on the one behavioral rule I had observed during the herding. The Tall Ones ignored lone individuals. Their hunting pattern was designed for groups, kites to compress, arcs to channel, cutting actions to split and drive. A single person moving alone across the wasteland was beneath the energy cost of pursuit. If my people scattered from the settlement in pairs and singles during a night march, moving toward the portal basin on separate bearings, the Tall Ones' herding tactics would have nothing to close around. Some would die of exposure, some would reach the portal and find it still impassable, but some might survive long enough in the open to find another option. A canyon system, a water source, a direction the Tall Ones did not patrol. It was a bad plan, I knew it. But it was the only plan that did not require me to stand in a clearing and count 28 people into the hands of the things that ate them. I gathered 11 people from my group who were willing to attempt it. Dennis was among them. We agreed on a departure time, third watch, when the canyon darkness was deepest and Garrett's perimeter scouts rotated shifts. I cached water and rations stolen from the communal supply in a side canyon near the settlement's eastern exit. Dennis caught me alone after the cache was placed. He had been watching the nursery entrance, where the children practiced the compliance call in soft, wavering bursts. "You know this won't save everyone," he said. "I know. You know it might not save anyone." I looked at him. His face was drawn tight from dehydration and exhaustion, but his voice was steady. That was Dennis's way. Bad news delivered clean. "I can't do his selection," I said. "No." Dennis looked toward the sleeping alcoves where our people lay under shade bought with other people's names. "You just made a different one." On the second night, 6 hours before the planned departure, Garrett's men came for us. There were 8 of them, armed with staves and the heavy mineral cement tools used for wall repair. They pulled Dennis and me from our sleeping alcove and bound our hands with cords stripped from the shade fabric rigging. Garrett stood at the canyon entrance and watched with his arms crossed while his men worked. "The woman who runs your supply station saw the cached rations," he said. "She reported it an hour ago." He told me the rest while his scouts marched us toward the settlement's perimeter. My plan had forced an acceleration. The Tall One's intake cycle was due in 2 days, but Garrett had sent a kite call through one of the older children, a priority signal requesting early collection. 2 high-value tributes delivered directly were worth more than 28 bodies at the standard rate. Garrett had negotiated a double water allotment and a full course of the crude antibiotics the Tall Ones occasionally supplied. Dennis and I together bought the settlement more than my entire group of 88 would have purchased in bulk. My refusal to cooperate had made cooperation impossible. My escape plan had forced the very trade I was trying to prevent, with Dennis and me as the currency. Dennis walked beside me through the dark canyon with his hands bound and his medic bag taken. He did not speak for the first kilometer. When he did, his voice was dry and controlled, the same tone he used when delivering casualty assessments in the field. "You could have taken the deal, Ray." I had no answer worth saying out loud. The march to the Tall One's city took 3 days across open wasteland under the red sun, bracketed by 2 of the creatures walking 100 meters to either side and a hunting kite riding the thermal above us. Dennis and I were part of a larger group, 32 people collected from various sources. Some came from the settlement's tribute pool. Others had been captured directly from the open desert, recent arrivals from crossings I had not known about, stumbling and sunblind, and too dehydrated to resist. On the second day, I recognized a section coordinator from my caravan. Her name was Nicole, Section 3, former bus mechanic from Marseille. She had been driven into the valley with the larger group and now walked 2 rows ahead of me with a mineral paste mark dried against her neck. She did not see me. Or she did, and decided there was nothing in seeing me that would help. By then, the arithmetic was simple enough for a child. 412 crossed. 88 reached the settlement. Dennis and I were removed from that number. 324 had been driven into the valley. At least one still lived in this column. The rest were somewhere ahead of us, behind us, or already entered into another ledger. We walked east. The terrain changed on the second day. The mineral hardpan gave way to rougher ground, cracked and scarred with deep erosion channels, and the rock beneath the sand turned dark, almost black, with a vitrified sheen that suggested extreme heat exposure at some point in this world's history. The Tall Ones moved through it without difficulty, their double-jointed legs adjusting to the uneven ground. On the third evening, we reached the crater rim. The city filled the crater floor below us, maybe 2 kilometers across. Towers built from a dark composite material rose at irregular intervals, some reaching 40 or 50 meters. Their rough ridged surfaces incorporated bone, human bone, animal bone, structural elements fused with mineral cement into load-bearing walls, buttresses, lintels. The architecture was functional and brutal, built by a species that used every available material and wasted nothing. Solar furnace arrays ringed the crater's outer edge, massive parabolic collectors 20 meters across, angled to track the red sun's arc and channel focused energy through conduit systems that ran down into the city's infrastructure. The furnaces gave the crater an orange underglow that turned the towers into black pillars against a burning floor. Between the towers, suspended on cable systems anchored to the buildings on either side, hung the cooling frames. Metal grid structures, each holding 8 to 12 human bodies in vertical rows, connected by tube systems to the tower infrastructure. The bodies were pale, wasted, stripped to the waist, and they moved. Small, involuntary twitches of limbs and heads, the residual motion of metabolisms slowed to the edge of function. I counted frames from the crater rim, dozens visible, hundreds of bodies. The group was marched down a switchback trail cut into the crater wall. At the city's edge, the Tall Ones processed us. They examined each person with their paired manipulator arms. 4 hands working independently, checking joints, pulling mouths open, pressing muscle groups, testing the flexibility of limbs. Stockyard evaluation, performed with the dispassionate thoroughness I had seen veterinarians use on cattle at FEMA staging camps during the agricultural collapses. Healthy individuals were marked with a mineral paste stripe across the shoulder and directed toward the tower district. Others were separated and moved toward a low structure near the furnace arrays that I could not see clearly and did not want to. Dennis was marked and walked into the tower district. I watched him go, his back straight, his stride steady, his bound hands hanging at his sides. He turned his head once at the last visible corner and looked at me across 60 meters of dark stone street. Then the tall one's handlers moved him out of sight, and he was gone into the frames. I was marked too. But when the handler pressed me toward the tower district, something changed. I had been studying the infrastructure since the crater rim, conduit junctions, load paths, energy distribution patterns, the way the solar furnace outputs converged on central trunk lines that ran underground toward the city's center. 14 years of reading failing infrastructure systems had made the assessment involuntary. I could not look at a building without tracing its power supply, could not see a pipe junction without estimating flow capacity, could not study a conduit array without mapping the network it served. The handler watched me watching the city's bones. It paused. Its narrow head tilted, and the recessed eyes fixed on my face while I tracked a main power trunk running from the nearest furnace array toward a massive structure at the crater's center. A low, wide building that sat like a bunker beneath the surrounding towers, fed by conduit lines from every direction. The handler redirected me, away from the tower district, away from the cooling frames, toward the central structure. The atmospheric machine occupied most of the building's interior, a biochemical reactor the size of a warehouse, segmented into processing chambers connected by pipe systems and catalytic beds. The heat was immense. Sweat dried before it could run. Every breath tasted metallic and sweet, like blood held too long in the mouth. Pressure systems and pump cycles ground in deep, arrhythmic pulses beneath the higher whine of energy converters drawing power from the solar furnace grid. A handler walked me through the complex with the familiarity of a technician showing a new worker the facility. The tall ones paused at junctions and chamber entrances, as if expecting me to understand what I was seeing. Some service corridors were too narrow for their bodies. Others were lined with hot conduit surfaces, their ridged skin avoided instinctively. Human hands could reach fittings their paired arms could not. Human bodies could be spent in places their own maintenance workers could not enter safely. I understood enough. The machine cycled organic material through thermal and biochemical processes that broke down tissue at the molecular level and released complex atmospheric compounds, trace gases the planet's degrading atmosphere required to remain breathable. The cooling frames in the towers above were holding tanks, keeping human bodies in a reduced metabolic state that extended the processing window for each individual. Input, throughput, output. A life support system for a dying planet, fed by the bodies of people who had crossed the portal looking for a world that would keep them breathing. The machine exhaled through roof vents in slow pulses. Each pulse shifted the air pressure inside the building, a subtle outward push against the eardrums, followed by a smell like hot stone, spoiled meat and rain that had never reached the ground. The machine was failing. I could read it in every surface. Corroded pipe sections patched with crude mineral welds, bypass valves jury-rigged from salvaged components, entire processing chambers sealed and dark, shut down because the parts to maintain them no longer existed. Catalytic beds discolored from media cycled past its effective lifespan and never replaced. The Tall One's world was dying, and the machine holding death at bay was dying with it. Every human body pulled through the portal brought another fractional extension of a countdown that could only end one way. I spent 4 days in the machine complex. The Tall Ones gave me maintenance tasks, clearing blocked conduit sections, tightening pressure fittings, assessing damage in offline chambers. They watched me work and adjusted their assignments based on what I could handle. I was useful. My hands and my training made me an asset inside the infrastructure that consumed my species, and every repair I completed extended the machine's operational window and the number of bodies it could process. On the third day, I found the power trunk. It ran from the solar furnace array through the machine complex's outer ring and continued underground, westward, through a conduit channel that extended beyond the crater's perimeter. West, toward the portal basin and the Saharan shimmer beyond it. I had mapped enough of the city's energy grid by then to understand what I was looking at. The portal was sustained by the furnace network. The shimmer above the Saharan dunes, the door that 412 people had walked through on my recommendation, was powered from this side. The Tall One's solar collectors kept it open. The one-way field was not a door in the way we understood doors. It was an intake valve. Pressure, energy, boundary geometry, all of it configured to admit matter from one side and resist it from the other. A supply system disguised from Earth as an escape route. The conduit ran through a junction point in the outer ring, a section currently offline for maintenance, accessible through a service corridor, staffed by a single handler on a rotating shift. The junction was a convergence node where 6 feeder lines from the furnace array merged into the main portal trunk. A cascading failure at that node would propagate through the trunk over days, degrading the power supply until the portal field destabilized and collapsed. I knew how to cause a cascading failure. I had spent 6 years with FEMA assessing exactly this kind of vulnerability in aging power grids, identifying the junction points where a targeted stress event would trigger progressive degradation through interconnected systems. I had written reports about it. I had briefed congressional committees on the specific failure modes of America's energy infrastructure. Now I was standing in the guts of an alien machine, looking at the same structural weakness I had catalogued 100 times in a country that no longer existed. Garrett arrived on the 5th day with a tribute delivery. 8 people from the settlement walked across the wasteland in the same bound column Dennis and I had travelled. I saw him at the city's processing area during the handler's intake evaluation. He saw me. His expression shifted through surprise, reassessment, and the quick calculation I had learned to recognize as the settlement's native mode of thought. I told him what I had found. The portal's power source. The junction point. The cascading failure that would close the door. Garrett listened with his arms folded and his eyes on the furnace arrays above us. "Every person already on this side stays on this side," he said. "Permanently." "Yes." "The machine runs out of input. The atmosphere keeps degrading. Everyone here, us, them, everyone in the settlement, is on a clock. The settlement has water and shelter. The Tall One's infrastructure is already collapsing. The clock was running before I got here. This changes what it's counting down toward." Garrett was quiet for a long time. He looked at the cooling frames strung between the towers above us, the rows of wasted bodies hanging in their tube-fed suspension, and I watched him calculate the numbers I had already run. The settlement's tribute quota was increasing. The machine's demand was accelerating as the atmosphere worsened. Halima's ledger was filling faster. At the current rate, the settlement's population, 120 people plus the survivors from my group, could sustain the tribute cycle for maybe 18 months before the pool was exhausted, and the Tall Ones came for the collaborators themselves. "I thought I was buying time," he said. "You were." He looked at me then. "That is not absolution," I said. "No," Garrett said, "but it is what we have here instead." He looked back toward the city. "When?" "I need a distraction during the furnace cycling interval. 20 minutes of access to the junction corridor without a handler. I can start a complication at the intake site. Wrong count, disputed assessment. It will pull the handlers from the outer ring for a few minutes. More than 20. I cannot promise." He left with his empty escort column. I waited through the next furnace cycle and marked the interval timing, 14 hours between full cycling events. During each cycle, the junction corridor powered down for thermal management. 12 minutes of reduced output while the feeder lines cooled and the main trunk operated on residual charge. That was my window. The next cycling event came in the early hours of the following morning. Garrett's complications started at the intake site. I heard the kite calls from across the city, sharp and agitated, as the handler's attention pulled toward the perimeter. The junction corridor was empty. I worked fast. Maintenance tools from the complex, a torque bar, a prying lever, a heavy striking tool designed for mineral cement work. I stressed the junction's thermal cladding at 6 critical points, driving fracture lines into the material at angles that would propagate under repeated heating and cooling cycles. I loosened the fastener arrays on the feeder line connections, backing them off just enough that thermal expansion would work them farther open over days. I cracked the junction's primary insulation housing along a seam that would channel heat into the support structure beneath. The damage was invisible from the outside. When the system powered back up, the junction would function normally for the first few cycles. Then, the fractures would grow. The fasteners would loosen. The insulation failure would overheat the support structure. Each furnace cycle would worsen the damage, and each worsening would increase the thermal stress on the next cycle. Within a week, 10 days at most, the junction would fail catastrophically, and the cascading power loss would starve the portal of the energy holding it open. I left the corridor as the handlers returned. Nobody stopped me. I walked through the city's outer ring in the dark, past the towers and the cooling frames and the bodies suspended between them, and I did not look up. Dennis was somewhere above me in those frames, and what I had just done guaranteed he would never come down. Dennis Ware. The paramedic from Tucson who had walked the entire column every day for 11 days, treating heat casualties, rationing his own water to give extra to the children. The man who had trusted my judgment enough to cross the portal, to follow me into the canyons, to stand beside me in the settlement when every other option required someone else to die. He was hanging in a cooling frame above an alien city, his metabolism slowed to a crawl, his body feeding the atmospheric machine that kept a dying world breathing. I had sealed the door that gave the tall ones their supply. The calculation was clear. If the portal stayed open, thousands more would come. Future caravans, driven by the same desperation that had driven mine, would walk through the shimmer and into the herding arcs, processing lines and cooling frames. Closing the door saved more people than it killed. The calculation was correct. It was also useless against Dennis's name. I crossed the wasteland alone. 2 days of walking under the red sun, navigating by the kite call patterns I had absorbed during my time in the city, directional signals, territorial markers, patrol routes. I avoided the hunting parties by moving at night and sheltering in erosion channels during the day. I drank from a seep I found in a rock crevice on the first morning. I ate nothing. Garrett's scouts found me on the second evening, a kilometer outside the settlement's canyon entrance. They brought me in without speaking, gave me water, and walked me to the central alcove where Garrett was waiting. He looked at my hands, raw and swollen from the work at the junction, and nodded once. "It's done," I said. "I know. The kite calls changed this morning. Agitation patterns from the city. The handlers know something is wrong with the furnace grid. But they are looking at the wrong section. You have days, maybe a week, before they trace it." I asked how many of my group remained. Garrett did not make me ask twice. 88 reached the settlement with you. 2 taken to the city. 4 died while you were gone. Dehydration, infection, 1 fall in the Eastern Canyon. 82 remain. And the Valley group? He looked away from me then, toward the shade cloth roof above the alcove. "Halima has new entries," he said. That was all. Halima came to the alcove that evening. She carried the ledger in its satchel, and she sat on the stone bench across from me with the cloth unrolled across her lap. She already knew. Garrett had told her everything before I arrived. She asked me what was traded and what was received. The same format as every other entry in the ledger. The same honest record she had kept for 2.5 years of human trafficking in a predator's wasteland. "The portal," I said. "Traded the portal. Received. Everyone who will never cross it." She wrote the entry in mineral ink. Careful letters, small and tight, filling the last available space at the cloth's edge. She recorded the date, or the settlement's approximation of 1, counted in days since the first crossing. She recorded what was paid. Portal access, permanent. She recorded what was received. Cessation of future crossings. She did not record Dennis's name separately. Dennis was already in the ledger, recorded under the entry from 6 days ago, when Garrett had traded him and me to the Tall Ones for water and antibiotics. His cost had already been written down by someone else. I was the only one who knew the cost had doubled. Halima rolled the ledger closed and tucked it into the satchel. She held it in her lap for a moment, feeling its weight. The weight of every name, every trade, every entry, since the first wave of crossings deposited her on this side of a door that was now dying. "The children will need the kite calls more than ever now," she said. "When the Tall Ones lose their supply, the arrangement changes. Everything we have is renegotiated from nothing." She left. I stood at the settlement's perimeter as the red sun dropped toward the western rim of the world, throwing the canyon walls into purple shadow. The air was thin and getting thinner. Every breath required a fraction more effort than the last, a deficit so small it was almost imperceptible, except that I had been breathing this atmosphere for more than 2 weeks and could feel the difference between the first breath and this one. The machine would slow. The atmosphere would continue its degradation. The Tall Ones would squeeze what remained from the bodies already in their frames, and when those were spent, they would look outward, toward the settlement. The kite calls the children were practicing would be the only language available for whatever negotiation came next. To the north, across kilometers of dark hardpan, the portal shimmered above the dunes. I could see it from the canyon rim. The vertical heat mirage shape, the wrong reflection, the red sun caught in its surface. But the shimmer was weaker than it had been when I first saw it from the Saharan side more than 2 weeks and an entire world ago. The edges wavered and frayed, the boundary between this atmosphere and Earth's losing coherence, the field destabilizing in the slow cascade I had engineered. In a week, maybe less, the shimmer would thin to nothing, and the dunes on the other side would disappear, and the door would close. Behind me, in the nursery alcove, the children were practicing their calls. The 11-year-old boy played a long, modulated pattern on his metal instrument, and the younger children repeated it in sequence, their voices rising and falling in the alien grammar they would carry into whatever this world became. They were learning the language of the species that had eaten their parents, recorded in a cloth ledger tucked into an old woman's satchel, and they were learning it because it was the only currency that might keep them breathing when the supply line from Earth went dark. I watched the portal die. The shimmer stuttered, thinned, recovered, stuttered again. Each cycle weakened. Each recovery came back less complete. The door I had opened for 412 people was closing because I had broken it from the inside. I stood on the wrong side with the knowledge that every repair I had ever made in my career, every grid I had stabilized, every infrastructure failure I had diagnosed and corrected, every system I had kept running for 1 more year, 1 more season, 1 more desperate month, had been training for this. 1 act of precise, targeted destruction. The only repair that mattered was the one that could not be undone. The red sun set. The furnace glow from the distant city throbbed against the eastern horizon, orange and deep, the light of a machine still running on the bodies it had already collected. Dennis was in that light somewhere. Beyond my reach, beyond retrieval, beyond anything I had the power to change. I stood at the edge of a canyon in a dying world and watched the door close. knowing that the next column of refugees who marched across the Saharan dunes toward the shimmer would find empty air above the sand. They would turn around, curse the wasted miles, and they would survive.